The rifle was already loaded. He didn't remember doing it. Maybe his hands had worked on their own, muscle memory from other missions, other camps, other long nights like this one. But he hadn't raised it yet. Not once. She stood across from him at the dying edge of the firelight, her feet bare in the dust, hair loose, chin high. The Comanche girl couldn't have been more than 17. She didn't flinch when the barrel hovered toward her. She didn't move when he stepped closer either. Just watched, eyes like black glass, steady, unblinking. Wind rolled over the desert scrub, hot and dry, carrying the scent of creosote and blood. The rifle in his hand felt heavier than it should have. He was sent to kill her tribe. That was the order. Burn what was left. No survivors. Not after what happened up at Marlow Creek. But now he just stood there, and then something strange happened. He flipped the rifle sideways, held it by the barrel, and offered it to her. Her gaze flicked to the weapon, then back to his face. For a long time, neither moved, neither spoke. The fire popped. Coyotes howled somewhere far off. And then he sat down. Just sat down in the dust, right there in front of her. Like a man too tired to carry out one more wrong thing. Let's go back. The week before, the skies over Texas were red with dust and fire. Marshal Taverner had ridden hard from Fort McGowan with 2 scouts and a letter sealed by Colonel Braith himself. They'd lost a wagon train, settlers from Tennessee, ambushed 2 miles east of Owl's Rock. Blame fell quick and hard on the nearby Comanche encampment. No trial, no questions, just vengeance. He was pulled in by name. Grady Niles, half-blood scout, ex-army sharpshooter, quiet as a shadow and mean when needed. He didn't drink, didn't talk much either. That made him useful, a hired man with no real ties and no taste for argument. Niles, Taverner had said, spitting tobacco juice onto the trail. We don't want prisoners, just smoke. Burn their camp and make damn sure they don't come back. Grady didn't ask for details. He just nodded once, climbed back on his horse, and pointed south. He'd grown up between 2 fires, a white father who taught him to shoot and a Comanche mother who never taught him how to belong. She died when he was 11. After that, he moved through the world like a ghost, never invited in, never fully turned away. That kind of boy becomes a dangerous man. The army saw to that. 3 days later, he reached the basin below Dry Mesa, where the scouts claimed the Comanche had holed up. Smoke still lingered in the distance, thin and gray, like the breath of something already dying. Grady watched from a ridge. What he saw wasn't a war party, it was a village in retreat. Women carrying children, old men dragging hides. No guards, no fighters left, just the scraps. He waited till dusk, crept through the arroyos like a mountain lion, and circled to the far edge. That's when he saw her, the girl with the bare feet, sitting beside a fallen cook fire. The rest had moved on, but she remained, either left behind or stayed by choice. He didn't know which. She didn't run when she saw him, didn't scream, just looked at him like she knew what he'd come for, and was waiting to see if he'd follow through. He could have ended it right there. That's what the colonel wanted. That's what his pay demanded. 1 shot, clean, cold, done. But he didn't. He walked down into the clearing, boots stirring ash and broken bone. She stood slowly, never looking away. Grady had been many things. Scout, soldier, killer. But never this. A man with a finger on the trigger and a conscience clawing its way back from the grave. That's when he did it, the unthinkable. He turned the rifle, offered it to her, and sat. A mile off, a pair of hawks circled low in the orange sky. The desert cooled with the onset of evening. Shadows stretched long, and the stars prepared their slow unfurling. She didn't take the rifle, but she didn't run either. She sat too, across from him, eyes still locked. Neither spoke, but something had changed. Far to the north, where Fort McGowan's flag still flapped on its tall pole, a decision had been made. But here in the dirt, in the quiet breath between sunset and nightfall, another decision was forming too. Grady Niles, the killer with no past and no future, had just disobeyed his orders. And the girl, whoever she was, had just become the only witness. A silence stretched. Then, from somewhere deep in the dusk, came the sound of hoofbeats. Not just one. Many. Ask ChatGPT. Grady didn't move when he heard the horses. Neither did she. The girl turned her head slightly, just enough to catch the rhythm of it. Not a gallop, not a charge. A steady trot, maybe 6 or 7 riders. Close enough now that the metal of the bridles rang faintly in the dark. Grady eased the rifle back into his lap but kept it angled down. She noticed but again said nothing. He could feel the weight of her stare like pressure in his ribs. When the riders crested the far ridge, their silhouettes stretched long against the moonlight. Mounted Comanche, maybe scouts, maybe survivors from the same camp he'd been sent to erase. He didn't recognize the man at the front, but the way the others flanked him meant something. This was no war party. This was what remained of one. They stopped 50 yards out. No weapons raised. Just watching. The girl stood slowly and lifted one hand. A quiet passed between them. A language Grady didn't know but could feel. She didn't shout. Didn't plead. She just stood still, her back to him, her arms still lifted, small and alone in the vastness of night. Then one rider dismounted. Older man, braids tied back. His shoulders were broad but heavy, not from strength but from time. He walked closer, eyes flicking once toward Grady, then settling on the girl. She spoke then, soft and short. Just a few words in Comanche. The man answered in the same language, voice like dry bark. Grady couldn't follow it, but the rhythm held no threat. Still, his hand hovered near the trigger. Then the man looked at him, not with rage, with disappointment. "You were sent to kill," the man said in broken English. "But you gave her your fire." Grady didn't speak. "She says you did not run, did not lie. You gave her gun. You Saturday." Grady finally nodded once. The man exhaled through his nose. Something close to a laugh, but not quite. "Strange man. She has no people left?" Grady asked, voice hoarse. The man's eyes narrowed. "She is last of her lodge. The others walked north. Some taken, some not." He paused. "We ride to find them, but she would not leave. She waited." "Waited for what?" The man glanced toward the fire. "You, maybe." They stood in silence, 3 figures under the vast sky. The others on horseback hadn't moved. The girl turned to Grady again, her face unreadable. Then, with slow steps, she walked to the older man and took his hand. "You keep your fire," the man said, motioning to the rifle. "But you come west now. These hills not safe. Soldiers circle back. No friends here. I can handle myself." "Maybe," the old man said, "but there are others who cannot. She stayed to see what kind of man you were. Now you've shown her." Grady's eyes narrowed. "Why would she care what kind of man I am?" The man tilted his head. "Because the kind who sits instead of shoots is rare." He turned and walked back to his horse. The girl hesitated. She looked once more at Grady. Longer this time, with something behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe, or challenge. Then she followed the old man, swinging up behind his saddle. Grady stayed by the fire, rifle resting across his knees, heart pounding not with fear, but with the dull ache of conscience. They rode off westward, dust curling up behind them like smoke from a dying wick. By dawn, Grady knew he couldn't go back to Fort McGowan. Not now. Not after this. When he arrived in Harper's Notch 2 days later, he kept to himself. Rented a small room above the smithy and spent his days repairing boots and tack, trying to disappear into the edges of town. But word travels quicker than silence. One afternoon, a man in a faded blue coat and silver mustache stepped into the smithy. He didn't introduce himself, but his voice was heavy with authority. "You were with the patrol from Fort McGowan. Name's Niles, right?" Grady kept sanding the stirrup he was working on. "They say you made it to the Comanche camp. Say you saw what happened." Grady glanced up. "That what they say?" "Colonel's looking for confirmation. Wants to know the job got done." Grady set the stirrup down. "The job got done," he said. The officer nodded once, slow. "And the girl? Any witnesses?" Grady met his eyes. No one left. The man gave a slow, satisfied breath. Good. Just need to make sure there ain't loose ends. He left a few minutes later, none the wiser. But Grady didn't sleep much that night, because he had left a witness, and her eyes were still with him every time he closed his own. The summer heat arrived early that year, dry and blistering, turning the roads to dust and the hills to brittle bone. In towns like Harper's Notch, that kind of heat did more than dry the land. It cracked tempers too. Grady kept to himself, fixed what needed fixing, paid his rent on time, and stayed out of trouble. But the wrong kind of quiet draws attention just the same. It was the blacksmith's son who first saw the rider, a man alone, pale dust trailing behind him like a ghost's veil. He came in slow but didn't tether his horse. Just stood at the edge of town looking like he was measuring something. Then, without word, he rode straight toward the saloon. Word traveled fast. By dusk, half the town knew someone had come from Fort McGowan asking questions. By morning, Grady knew who they were asking about. The blacksmith cornered him behind the shop, jaw tight, wiping sweat from his brow with a ragged sleeve. That rider talked to Dunley and Boone, asking if we seen a scout with Comanche blood. Said it's about the girl. Grady didn't answer. The man grabbed his arm. You best leave before the town decides they don't want you here no more, he muttered. Grady nodded once. I was already fixing to, but it wasn't the townsfolk he feared. It was the sound he heard 2 nights later, a low, distant thunder. Rhythmic, unnatural, drums, faint but real, echoing through the rock valleys like an old memory. Not the kind for celebration, the kind that came before reckoning. Grady stood on the porch of his room above the smithy, bare arms crossed over his chest, staring into the darkness. The wind carried heat even at night, but he felt a cold bloom behind his ribs. Somewhere out in those hills, something was stirring. He didn't sleep that night either. By morning, the sheriff had posted up at the general store, already sweating through his vest, trying to calm jittery folk. Now let's not jump to conclusions, he said to the crowd. Could be any tribe passing through. Then why the drums? A woman asked. You ever heard 'em play that way when they weren't calling for war? The sheriff swallowed hard. Doesn't mean it's about us. Grady pushed through the crowd, eyes sharp. What direction did they hear him from? Northwest Ridge, the sheriff said reluctantly. Past Widow's Draw. That made Grady go still. The draw wasn't far from where he'd last seen the girl, and the others who had taken her in. He turned, heading back to the smithy. Where you going? The sheriff called. To get my horse. What for? Grady didn't stop walking. To stop you all from doing something stupid. He rode out before noon, the rifle strapped tight across his saddle. He took the long route, cutting west around the draw, avoiding the trails the townsfolk used, just in case. By dusk, he spotted the smoke, thin and rising, like the memory of a campfire. When he crested the ridge, they were already there. A dozen Comanche, old men, young scouts, 2 women with painted cheeks, and at the center, her. She stood taller now, braids tied clean, a strip of blue cloth at her waist. The girl who hadn't spoken to him weeks ago now gave orders with her hands. A different kind of silence, the kind that had weight. She saw him before the others did. Didn't move, just held his gaze across the clearing, as if she'd been expecting him. He dismounted, hands open. You shouldn't be this close to town, he said gently. They're scared. When folks get scared, they shoot. The old man from before stepped forward. We did not come for fight. Then why the drums? We call our own, the man said. One of ours was taken by soldiers near the canyon. Young boy, your people say Comanche must answer for every death, but they steal children and say nothing. Grady swallowed. You think they'll listen to that in town? You show up with drums and bows, and they'll shoot first and ask never. The girl stepped forward now. She looked at him long, then pointed to the blue cloth. She wears the sign of peace, the elder said. She wears it for you. Grady blinked. For me? The man nodded. Because you did not shoot. Because you gave her your fire. Grady looked at her. The girl's face didn't change, but something in him did. A rustling behind him made him turn. 5 riders, townsfolk, rifles drawn, coming fast up the trail. "No," Grady whispered. "Too soon." The elder called out in Comanche, and the scouts dropped to crouch, bows raised. It was all happening too fast. Grady ran forward, raising both hands. "Stop!" The riders slowed but didn't lower their rifles. One of them, Boone, called out, "That them, Niles? Is this who's bringing war to our valley?" "They're not here for war," Grady said. "They're looking for a boy, taken by soldiers." Boone snorted. "Convenient story." One of the younger riders lifted his gun higher. "Let's just be done with this." "No!" Grady shouted. "They came in peace. The girl, she was there that night. She could have killed me. Instead, she waited. She gave me time to choose something better." Boone's horse sidestepped. "And what did you choose, Grady?" Grady looked back toward the girl. He didn't answer Boone, but he stepped between them, unarmed, just a man, standing in the middle of something bigger than himself. The wind caught the edges of his coat as he stood between the rifles and the riders, arms spread like a gate not meant to open. Sweat clung to his neck, but he didn't move. Neither did the girl. Boone's rifle didn't lower. "You're gonna die in their defense, Niles?" he called. "For what?" "Some squaw with a blue rag." Grady didn't turn. "You know me, Boone. You know what I was before. You know what I'm capable of." Boone hesitated, spitting into the dust. "That's exactly why we're standing here instead of already shootin'. But even you ain't got the right to put us all at risk." Grady took a step forward, voice low. "You think they came for war? You're wrong. They came for their kin. A boy, taken by white soldiers. You ever have a son taken from you, Boone?" Boone didn't answer, but his jaw worked tight. Behind Grady, the Comanche elder raised one hand. The girl stepped up beside him. And then, she did something none of them expected. She moved toward Grady slowly, cautiously. And from her side, she pulled something wrapped in deerskin. Small, delicate. She unwrapped it, right there in the space between tension and violence. Inside was a simple object. A child's boot. Worn, dirty, but clearly not Comanche-made. Too new, too small. She held it out. Let them all see. Grady glanced at Boone. "You recognize it?" Boone's eyes locked on the little boot. "That's a settler's. That ain't theirs." "No," Grady said softly. "It's yours." "What are you talking about?" "Your brother's boy. The one they said ran off last season." Boone blinked, suddenly unsure. Grady looked at the elder. "Where's the boy now?" "He is safe. In the canyon with women," the man said. "We waited until he spoke his name. He was taken in raid. Not by us, by deserters. We found him wandering." Grady turned back. "They could have left him, killed him, but they didn't." Boone's face cracked, just slightly, like a man trying not to feel something heavy. The girl stepped closer now, just behind Grady. The air between them shifted. She spoke then, softly, in English. "Men who steal do not wear feathers." Boone's rifle lowered a fraction. The other riders looked to him, waiting. She took another step forward. Then, slowly, gently, she handed the small boot to Boone. His hand hovered, then took it. The air seemed to still. Grady exhaled. A silence settled, not empty, but full. Then Boone spoke, voice gruff and quiet. "They bring the boy back and we talk. Not before." The elder nodded. "Sunrise tomorrow, at Widow's Draw." No one moved for a long while. Then Boone reined his horse and turned back down the trail. The others followed, uncertain but not angry now. When their hoofbeats faded, Grady turned to the girl. She was looking at him again, but not like before. Now, there was warmth there. "You speak English," he said. She nodded. "My mother did. I never wanted to use it. Not until now." He tried a smile. "You waited back at the camp. For me. Why?" She was quiet. Then she said, "Because you didn't look away." Grady felt his chest ache with something old and buried. "They'll still be afraid," he said. Even if you bring the boy. She nodded. Fear is always the first story. But maybe not the last. She looked up at him, the faintest curve at her mouth. No, she said. Not if we write the next one. And for the first time since he'd offered her that rifle, she reached for his hand. Not in desperation, not in forgiveness, but in choice. And Grady took it. Dawn came slow, as it always did out on the high plains, a soft unwinding of color across the sky, casting long shadows and catching every edge in golden quiet. Widow's Draw waited in stillness, the red rock cliffs on either side glowing like hollowed embers. Grady stood near the center of the dry wash, arms crossed, face turned eastward. The girl, her name was Taya, he'd finally learned, stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The Comanche party had already gathered in the shallows of the draw. A half-circle of riders and elders, their horses quiet, eyes sharp but calm. They hadn't brought war paint, no feathers, just patience. And a boy. He couldn't have been more than 6. Freckled face, straw-colored hair, wrapped in a buckskin shawl with a look in his eyes like he'd seen too much, too fast. He clutched the elder's hand and blinked at the sun. Grady felt something tighten in his chest. From the opposite ridge, the townsfolk came. Slower this time, fewer rifles. Boone at the front, his coat dusty, jaw set. He had the child's boot tied to his saddle horn. They didn't speak when they arrived, didn't wave, just stared across the wide, dry wash at the people they'd feared only days before. Then the elder lifted the boy and set him gently on the ground. The boy blinked at the faces, turned once toward the Comanche woman who had been holding his hand, and then toward Boone. Grady stepped out into the center between both groups. His name is Micah Boone. Boone's eyes flicked. That right? Grady nodded. Said it himself yesterday. The boy looked toward Boone, uncertain, then slowly stepped forward, one cautious foot after another, until he stood right in the middle of Widow's Draw. Boone dismounted. He crouched low, looked the boy in the eye. Micah? He asked, voice not much louder than the wind. The boy hesitated, then nodded. Boone's hand trembled as he reached for him, touching his shoulder first, then pulling him gently into a rough embrace. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause. Taya watched without expression, but her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white. The elder beside her murmured something in Comanche. She didn't reply. Grady turned toward her, his voice low. You could have kept him, raised him. She nodded. But then I would become like the ones who take. Across the draw, the tension began to ease. The other townsfolk dismounted slowly. Some nodded toward the Comanche riders. No words, just small, cautious acknowledgments. Boone lifted Micah into his arms and carried him toward the others. As he passed Grady, he stopped. He didn't say thank you, but he looked Grady in the eyes. And in that look, there was something close to understanding. Boone climbed back into the saddle with Micah in front of him, then rode off down the draw without another word. The rest followed. Grady stayed behind. So did Taya. When the dust settled, and only the breeze remained, she turned to him. You should go with them, she said. That's where your life is. He shook his head. Not anymore. She tilted her head. Then where? Grady looked out at the horizon. The empty hills. The silence. Wherever you are. For a long time she said nothing. Then, with the faintest smile, she turned and began walking toward her people. She didn't look back. But after a few seconds, she raised her hand. Not a wave, just a signal. A gesture she had once used to tell her kin he was not the enemy. He followed. Not far behind. Just enough space for the dust between them to settle. Years later, in the hill country west of Harper's Notch, travelers would sometimes pass a small homestead built from cedar and clay, tucked in a bend near the river. No flag flew, no gate barred the path. But those who came seeking water or kindness never left empty-handed. A woman with dark braids would greet them. Her eyes were clear and still. Sometimes a man would appear too, tall, quiet, with a rifle he rarely touched. They said he used to be a scout, killer. But that was before he sat down in the dirt and offered his fire to someone who had every right to hate him. They lived without war. Not because peace was easy, but because they chose it again and again even when no one else did.